to see him transform into an activist. But then, that's what it was like in those days. People kept transcending themselves, like the ordinary Beijingers who came by every day to check on the students and to lend support. A rumor went around in those weeks that even the pickpockets were on strike in solidarity. Shenqi also came to the square day after day. When Hu Yaoban died, he and some friends were just about to open an exhibition, but on hearing the news they abandoned it immediately to go to Tiananmen. All through April and into the hot days of May he wandered there, excited, shocked, trying to make sense of it all. The students from Peking University and the others, their thinking was so advanced, so deep. I thought of what we art students had been concerned with, fighting propaganda art and so on. Such small things. I was so impressed by them. But as the weeks passed, he also felt the pressure mounting as the city ground to a standstill. The buses had stopped running, and cars could no longer drive on the streets, and you could sense the danger building. His parents kept writing, calling, beseeching him to come home. From far off Anhui, maybe it was easier to see the danger. In the square, the students didn't yet feel afraid. They felt like heroes. They believed the country was on their side. Having the world's media focusing on them, too, was seductive. Yet, the ground had already shifted under their feet. Up until Gorbachev's visit, they had the protection of the reformers in the government, in particular Zhao Ziyang. But in holding the square, they had humiliated Deng Xiaoping and fatally undermined the moderate position being urged by Zhao Ziyang. Gorbachev's visit was to have been Deng's crowning achievement in foreign affairs, with China's one-time big brother coming to Beijing to pay court. The students had robbed Deng of the official ceremonies that would have been so gratifying. Gorbachev inspecting a military honor guard in Tiananmen Square. Gorbachev with bare head bowed placing a wreath at the monument to the people's heroes. Instead, the square belonged to the students, and all the world's cameras were trained on them. The day after he met with Gorbachev, Deng gathered the Politburo Standing Committee at his home. Zhao Ziyang again urged him to revise the People's Daily editorial to calm the situation. But instead, Deng announced his decision to impose martial law. Zhao refused his support, sealing his downfall. His rival, Premier Li Peng, was put in charge of implementing the decision. Martial law was not declared until 2 days later, and in those 2 days there occurred two extraordinary contrasting spectacles. The first took place on May 18th, when Li Peng finally met with the student representatives at the Great Hall of the People in a nationally televised encounter. It was 4 weeks since the student petitioners had knelt on the steps of the building, begging him to receive them. 4 weeks in which the student movement had engulfed the city and brought it to a standstill. But when he finally met them, Li Peng still showed no sign of actually listening. Instead, he talked down to the students as if they were children, telling them that they must bring their hunger strike to an end immediately and leave the square. He made no attempt to disguise his irritation when students pressed their conditions, expressing impatience with such quibbling. The student leader, Wu Erkaishi, who had collapsed at the hunger strike earlier that day, came to the meeting in his hospital-issued striped pajamas and carrying an oxygen canister. But he showed no sign of being cowed by the occasion. He spoke directly and vehemently to Li Peng. The students on the square would make their own decision based on the government's response, and their conditions were clear. The People's Daily editorial must be repealed and genuine dialogue established. The sight of this young man in pajamas going head-to-head with the dour, Mao-suited Premier of China was electrifying. The confrontation between the government and the students had been playing out for weeks on the streets, but now he saw it vividly, made flesh. The students were rejecting the paternalism on which the Chinese Communist Party rule was based and demanding their right to be heard. But as much as I wanted to maintain my optimism, watching the broadcast, I found it hard to fight a sense of foreboding. We had been mesmerized by what we had seen on the street, the swelling popular support, the passion of youth, the joy on the faces of the Chinese journalists finally getting a chance to do their jobs, and in doing so, we had lost the sight of the power imbalance between the students and the government. The power was not on the street with the students, but with this middle-aged man in a Mao suit shifting irritably in his anti-massacre-draped armchair as the students pressed their case. And we didn't even know that he held 2 trump cards. Martial law was looming, and his rival, Zhao Ziyang, was finished. The second spectacle could not have been more different. In the early hours of May 19th, The day after the student leaders met with Li Peng, a clearly emotional Zhao Ziyang came to the square to talk directly to the students himself. Speaking into a megaphone that students passed up to him, he implored them to end their hunger strike, which was now entering its 7th day. He told them he understood them, that in his youth his generation had also taken great risks for the revolution, and in so saying, made it clear that he respected their patriotism. He told them if they stopped, dialogue would definitely not be closed, and many things could be resolved. They were young with their lives ahead of them, he said, and he asked them to think of what the consequences would be if they continued. It was the nearest to a warning he could give. When he finished, the students mobbed him for his autograph, passing up scraps of paper to sign, even pushing forward their pajama sleeves for him to write on. But they did not heed his warning. It was the last time that Zhao would be seen in public. After June 4th, he would be formally removed from all his posts and would spend the rest of his life under house arrest. In those last days before martial law was declared, a very different kind of celebrity also came to Tiananmen Square. Cui Jian. Nothing to My Name was the student's unofficial anthem, but on that day, he chose to perform another song, which would in the years that followed become just as deeply associated with Tiananmen Square. It was called A Piece of Red Cloth. In this song, Cui Jian tells of how someone blindfolded him with a piece of red cloth and then asked him what he could see. Happiness, he replied. They asked him how it made him feel. Comfortable. It made him forget that he had no place to call home. They asked him where he wanted to go, and he told them he wanted to follow them. They asked him what he was thinking. He said, I want to let you be my master. Before he sang the song, he called out to the students, Listen up. The person asking the questions in this song is not a girl. It's the government. It was the government that had blindfolded them, he was telling them. It was the government that had wanted them to find happiness in seeing the world their way. In those spring days, the students had thrown off the blindfold. They could applaud Cui Jian's words and sing along, but before long, most would be wearing the blindfold again. On the morning of May 20th, martial law was declared. Army units had begun to advance on Beijing from all directions the previous night, but ordinary Beijingers once more rallied to protect the students. Makeshift roadblocks were thrown up at key intersections leading into the center of the city, and tens of thousands of people surrounded the convoys, stalling the troops in the suburbs. A group of independent traders set up a motorcycle squad they called the Flying Tigers, which zipped around the city bringing news of troop movements back to the students in the square. The student leaders called off the hunger strike, but clashed over what to do next. Wu Kaishi, for all his fieriness, pushed a moderate line, urging the students to withdraw for their own safety, but also to undermine the rationale for martial law and give the reformers a chance to regroup. But the more radical voices in the movement argued that to give up the square was to give up their power. One passionate student leader, Chai Ling, who had risen to prominence during the hunger strike, argued that the square was the students' only stronghold, and to give it up meant certain defeat. It was her argument that prevailed. In the days leading up to the final crackdown, Chai Ling would become one of the most recognizable voices in the movement, rallying the students to defend the square, resisting arguments to withdraw. In the days after martial law was declared, many Beijing University students did return to their campuses, but this left the square dominated by students from outside the capital. More than 50,000 of them had arrived in Beijing in the days before martial law. Those recently arrived craved their time in the sun. Just as martial law was declared, a new element had been introduced to the protests, one that was particularly threatening to the government. A group of workers had announced the establishment of an independent workers' union at Tiananmen Square. This raised the specter of the Solidarity Trade Union in Poland, which had fought a grueling 10-year battle with the Polish communist regime and had just run an agreement from the government for parliamentary elections, scheduled ironically enough for June 4th. The balance in China slid even further away from moderation. As army units remained stalled in the suburbs of the capital, some soldiers actually partied and sang revolutionary songs with the local residents. Around the city, Beijingers extended small acts of kindness to the soldiers, bringing them food and drink, and they showed little urgency to move on to take control of the center of the city. On May 23rd, in an extraordinary act of defiance of the martial law order that banned all demonstrations, Once again, 1 million people rallied in Beijing, waving placards that read, "Long live democracy," and "Freedom for the press." In the square, vendors sold Beijing street snacks and soft drinks, and a party atmosphere descended across the city, seemingly making a mockery of martial law. But the square was becoming more squalid in the heat, and the sense of stalemate had sapped the students' resolve. Moderates among the student leadership again urged a move back to their campuses to regroup. On May 27th, this moderate position was carried by a vote of the key student leaders, but almost immediately afterward, the more radical among them changed their mind and declared they would stay after all. The students on the square, the majority of whom were new to the protest, supported the radicals enthusiastically. It was one more missed chance. There were people who were really trying to achieve something, Guo Jian told me later, and others who were just trying to make things worse. I was trying to make people believe we had already achieved things and we didn't need to sacrifice ourselves there. But if you said that, people thought you were scared or you were a traitor. Meanwhile, Deng Xiaoping had rallied the support of army commanders around the country, directing each to send seasoned troops to Beijing to augment the greener ones that were in a holding pattern in the suburbs. Soon, there would be some 200,000 troops surrounding the capital, rivaling the number that had been mobilized during the war against Vietnam 10 years before. As May drew to a close, despite the resolve of the radicals among the students, it seemed that their occupation of Tiananmen Square was petering out of its own accord. Many Beijing-based students had returned to campus, while some of the outsiders were beginning to leave too. But in these last days before the crackdown, 2 further events again would bring Tiananmen Square to life. My friend sat in a corner of the studio watching intently. The student leaders on the square had asked the Central Academy of Fine Arts to create something special to inspire their fading movement. Now, after 3 days' work by dozens of students, the project was taking shape. She had watched as the young artists formed the giant pieces of sculpture out of wood and polystyrene, and then swathed them in white plaster. The sculpture's face was visible now, along with its flowing hair, upstretched hands, and the torch they held. She was a goddess of democracy. Her features seemed vast. She had been designed to stand more than 10 meters tall enough to stand eye to eye with Mao Zedong's portrait above Tiananmen Gate. They brought her to Tiananmen on the back of 3 pedal carts late on the evening of May 29th, to the whoops of excitement from the square. Overnight, they built a scaffold and then raised each piece into place. Before noon the next day, the young artists made their last touches, smoothing the goddess's hair and her flowing robes with fresh plaster. Meanwhile, news had spread throughout the city of this strange apparition at Tiananmen, and by noon, the square once again hummed with people. The art students had delivered on their promise and had fanned the movement into flame again. They had also delivered an extraordinary provocation. There was no mistaking that their goddess was the sister of the Statue of Liberty. The students had brought a symbol of foreign power into the very heart of China's capital and set her face in flaming torch towards Mao. This theatrical, reckless act was yet another gift to the hardliners. In the previous few days, Li Peng had commissioned reports from the Beijing government and the security service on the true nature of turmoil and Western infiltration aimed at demonstrating that the student movement was a front for a foreign plot to overthrow the party. Now the students had provided the perfect cover image for those reports. Huang Rui had been watching the demonstrations unfold for weeks on his television in Japan. He understood only too well why the students would want to occupy Tiananmen Square. He knew the excitement of rallying at the heart of Beijing, but he also knew how badly it could end. As June approached, he could see the students were in trouble. Finally, he couldn't just watch anymore. He gathered together as much money as he could in donations and flew to Beijing. On June 2nd, Li Peng met with Deng Xiaoping to brief him, the other party elders in the Politburo Standing Committee. Based on the reports he had commissioned, Li Peng painted a frightening picture of a student movement infiltrated by CIA agents and intelligence operatives from Taiwan, of turmoil whipped up by an alliance of Western and domestic reactionary forces bent on the destruction of the party and socialism. Foreign students, journalists, and diplomats were all part of the plot, as was the United States broadcaster, The Voice of America. Even the Fulbright program was implicated, accused of using academic exchange as a means of spiritual infiltration aimed at drawing the country into the United States bourgeois web. These foreign forces were in league with black hands within China who hid behind university posts, think tanks, and private companies to promote their reactionary ideas and manipulate the students. In Li Peng's briefing, the new independent student and worker associations were all engaged in underground activities to overthrow the government. He spoke of their secret oaths and attempts to instigate mutiny among the martial law troops. Tiananmen Square had been occupied to provide a frontline command center for the turmoil, a base for counter-revolutionary propaganda and for assaults on the party and the government, a place from which they would direct their final showdown. To achieve their purpose, the student occupiers had gathered around them terrorist groups like the Flying Tiger Motorcycle Brigade and trampled on the sacred and solemn space of Tiananmen. There was no mention of the students' long-standing calls for dialogue and the reversal of the editorial. Their real aim, Li said, was the overthrow of the government. In fact, he said, the students had even drawn up a list of officials marked for execution. His briefing did not explain how a small group of students had managed to manipulate millions of their fellow Chinese to support them. It did not acknowledge that the students who remained on the square might simply have painted themselves into a corner, that, under the threat of the People's Daily editorial, they were too frightened to abandon Tiananmen. Deng Xiaoping's mind was made up. Stability must take precedence over everything, he said, so Tiananmen Square must be cleared. There were no dissenting voices. The moderates on the Politburo Standing Committee, who had earlier argued against martial law, Zhao Ziyang and Hu Qili, had already been removed from power. Qiao Shi, who had abstained during the martial law debate, now fell into line. Later that day, the order was given for troops to begin their advance on the city center. Overnight on June 2nd, an attempt was made to infiltrate large numbers of troops into the city wearing plain clothes, while their arms were brought into the city in unmarked vehicles. Although a number of soldiers in arms reached their rallying points around Tiananmen Square in this way, a traffic accident late that night in the west of the city exposed this maneuver, and by the early hours of June 3rd, students and ordinary Beijingers had converged again on the main intersections leading into the city to set up roadblocks. Army vehicles were overturned, tires were punctured, soldiers scattered. Buses carrying groups of soldiers and weapons were surrounded and stopped. A group of demonstrators discovered a bus filled with armaments just near Zhongnanhai, and police and soldiers tear-gassed the crowd to regain control of the vehicle. All through the day on June 3rd, tension mounted as large crowds gathered in the streets near the square, bringing traffic to a standstill. In the square itself, a last, somewhat theatrical attempt to engage the government was playing out. On June 2nd, a group calling themselves the Four Gentlemen announced a new hunger strike on the square. The gentlemen included Taiwanese-born pop star Hou Dejian and an iconoclastic critic called Liu Xiaobo. These two men were both stars in different ways. Hou Dejian was handsome, famous, and fresh from Hong Kong, where he had played a benefit concert for the student movement alongside the beloved diva Deng Lijun. Liu Xiaobo was popular in student circles for his passionate critiques of Chinese culture and for his vehement belief in the need for intellectuals to get involved rather than commentate from the sidelines. In years to come, he would become China's most famous prisoner of conscience. Liu Xiaobo had been in New York when the demonstrations had begun, but he could not resist coming home to participate. Over the weeks, he had helped the students out in various ways and tried to give them counsel, particularly on the need for them to legitimize their leadership through democratic elections. But he now felt it was time to put himself more firmly on the line. He and his fellow gentlemen called for martial law to be lifted, dialogue to be renewed, and for an embrace of democratic principles on all sides. The square soon filled again with people eager to witness this new spectacle. But it was all too late. There was no one left in power who had any interest in compromise. In Zhongnanhai, the fierce resistance to the entry of the troops to the city on the night of June 2nd, and this new hunger strike only served to harden the leadership's resolve. Late in the afternoon on June 3rd, the leadership agreed to use any means necessary to put down what was now described as a counter-revolutionary riot in the capital. Deng Xiaoping made just two stipulations: the square must be cleared by dawn on June 4th, and that there was to be no blood shed on the square itself. On June 3rd, Huang Rui wandered uneasily near the square. He was booked to fly out the next day. When he had first arrived in Beijing in late May, he found the situation chaotic, but he had not felt the foreboding he felt now. He had had this bad feeling in his gut before, in April 1976, before the morning demonstrations for Zhou Enlai had been broken up by the militia. Tiananmen Square was a symbolic space. In 1976 and again now, there was a fight between the government and the people to control it. History told him who would win. Out in the university quarter, Anwar had been noticing her for days, a girl crying by the gates as the students left for the square. She was the last person he'd expected to see cry. She used to come to his parties and dance all through the night. Now she stood day after day crying by the side of the road. "Why are you crying?" he asked. "Because they won't be coming back," she said. He thought it was ridiculous. What reason was there to think that? Later, he would remember her and realize how much this sad young Cassandra had understood. On the night of June 3rd, Guo Jian was in the square when the word came. People came running in, shouting, "They're shooting! They're shooting!" But in the square, it was still quiet. He decided to head west to see for himself. He pedaled fast down the Avenue of Eternal Peace, with a classmate by his side toward the western suburbs and the major intersection of Mushidi. Surely they were firing rubber bullets, he thought. The army wouldn't shoot Chinese citizens. Since early that night, an announcement warning people to stay off the streets had been broadcast on a continuous loop on radio, television, on PA systems throughout the city, and on university campuses. But instead of staying in their houses, tens of thousands of Beijingers were converging on the major intersections leading into the center to main roadblocks. For 2 weeks they had kept the troops out of the city. That night, they planned to do the same. But on the night of June 3rd, they would face a very different army to the one they had encountered 2 weeks before. Regiments had been bolstered by seasoned troops from around the country. Tens of thousands of infantry, backed up with artillery and tank units, were under strict orders to reach Tiananmen Square by 1 a.m. on June 4th and have it cleared by dawn. The soldiers carried assault rifles loaded with battlefield ammunition. The 38th Group Army entered the city from the west, along the grand east-west axis that becomes Chang'an Avenue, the Avenue of Eternal Peace. It might have been expected that the 38th would have some sympathy with the citizens and students of Beijing. Based near the capital in the neighboring province of Hebei, they had connections within the city, and some Beijing students had even done their military reserve training with them the previous summer. In fact, in the weeks before the final crackdown, the commanding officer of the 38th, Major General Xu Qingxian, had challenged the order to impose martial law. When his corps rolled into Beijing on June 3rd, he was under arrest. Under new command, the 38th proved the most zealous that night in carrying out their orders. Perhaps his predecessor's insubordination made the new commander all the keener to prove his loyalty, or maybe it was because the resistance to the troops was greater in the west of the city. But whatever the reason, the 38th Group Army's entry to the capital proved the bloodiest of that bloody night. When they met the first roadblock on the east-west axis at Gongzhufen, they initially used tear gas and rubber bullets to push back the crowd. Then as the crowd reformed and finally stood in a wall thousands strong, the infantry dropped into battlefield formation and opened fire directly into the crowd. From then on, they followed the same ruthless pattern, ineffectual attempts at riot control followed by deadly force. Later, the government would claim that the army had insufficient riot gear to control the crowds that night, making the use of live fire unavoidable. But the deciding factor on the night was not resources, but the order that they must reach the square by 1 a.m. They were on a deadline, and nothing was allowed to stand in their way. The bloodiest engagement anywhere in the city that night was at Mushidi, just 2 kilometers further along the road to the square from Gongzhufen. Mushidi is now, as it was then, a comfortable residential area, dotted with high-rise apartments housing senior government officials. Those apartments overlook the bridge where Beijing citizens and students once more tried to stop the soldiers' advance. The crowds had pushed buses across the road and armed themselves with bricks and broken-up concrete with which they battled the anti-riot brigade who arrived first on the bridge. Beaten back, the brigade was replaced by soldiers who rushed across the bridge in waves, firing into the crowd. Each time they fired, the people scattered only to regroup. Slowly, the soldiers pushed the people back across the bridge, firing repeatedly into the crowd, who still tried to fight them with whatever fell to hand. Soon, At least 100 people lay bleeding out on the street. The residents of the apartment blocks cursed the soldiers from their windows, yelling, "Murderers! Fascists! Bandits!" and raining objects down on their heads. And so the soldiers began to strafe the apartments too. At least 3 people died at home that night, one of them while fetching a glass of water by an open window. Once the infantry had cleared the bridge, armored personnel carriers, trucks, and tanks drove across behind them, heading east toward the square. In their wake, some citizens erected fresh roadblocks and set them ablaze, while others rushed the dead and dying to the nearby Fuxing Hospital. On the road where the army vehicles had passed lay the tangled blood and flesh of some who were beyond salvation. The 38th rolled eastward, stalked by a crowd who followed at some meters' distance. The soldiers fired into the crowd whenever they felt challenged, whether by Molotov cocktails, rocks, or with shouts, as they moved inexorably toward the square. As Guojian rode nearer to Mushidi with his classmate, he could hear the sound of gunfire, but it still sounded to him like fireworks. He couldn't believe they'd be using live ammunition, but as they got nearer, he began to see the dead and wounded by the side of the road, and he knew, this is real now. They rode up beside the Fuxing Hospital, and from there, Guojian could see smoke from the burning roadblock at Mushidi. Armored trucks and tanks were rolling toward them out of the haze. He watched in horror as soldiers fired directly into the crowd. They weren't firing wildly. They were taking aim, firing, maneuvering, then firing again. It was exactly like when he was in the army. These men were firing as they had been trained to do in battle. Guojian and his classmate ran down into the entrance of the hospital and found the foyer awash with blood. The wounded from Mushidi and beyond were brought to the hospital in a constant stream, on the backs of pedal carts, on bicycles, on anything that could serve as a stretcher. Beside the entrance where the bicycles were normally parked, bodies lay in a pile. Guojian longed to do something heroic, but he felt paralyzed. He sat down on a chair inside the door. His classmate slumped beside him. And then a doctor came out and said, "We need help. Come with me." And he took us into a room where we almost slipped in the blood. There was so much blood. I couldn't look at it, and so I just looked at the doctor. He told me he needed someone to take out the dead bodies to create space for the wounded coming in. But I just couldn't do it. I walked out. It was too much for me. I thought, I don't want to be a man. And I sat down again feeling so guilty. Then I heard someone say they needed people to carry in the wounded from the street, and I thought, I can do that. The wounded were lying where they'd been shot. The army was still passing by. Guojian and the other volunteers waved white cloths as they went to lift the first person from the road. We carried the first guy back to the hospital. His blood was running out like water. He was alive then, but I don't know if he survived. Then we went out again to collect the next person. But this time the soldiers started shooting. We scattered, but one of us was shot, and after that, we knew there was nothing more we could do. Nothing they could do, they thought, but ride west to their campus and warn their classmates not to come to the square. On the way, they passed Mushidi. In an apartment block overlooking the bridge, they saw an old lady standing on her balcony screaming down at the soldiers who were still rolling into the city below her. She was yelling, "Fascists! Fascists!" and the soldiers fired straight at her. Then she was quiet. Later, her neighbors carried her body down into the street. They rode on until they reached their university, where they could tell them what they had seen. My friend made her way up towards Chang'an Avenue from her home in the Hutongs, south of the square. It was past midnight. Earlier that night, she had been in the square and afterwards had walked aimlessly through the streets nearby with a young student friend. They had been seized with a kind of restless energy for days. What was the government going to do? They knew something must happen, but what? It was such a warm night, and after hours of walking, she had finally conceded to her friend that her new fashionable shoes didn't fit her after all. She would have to go home and change them. He'd be fine on his own, he said. They agreed to meet back at the intersection of Chang'an Avenue and Xidan, west of Tiananmen Square. But now as she neared Chang'an Avenue, she heard a sound like fireworks, but she knew it wasn't fireworks. The broad avenue was lined with people, thousands standing by the road watching the army roll eastward towards the square. In the distance, There was a glow of fire from burning roadblocks. She searched for a friend, but couldn't see him. The street was bathed in a strange light, the glowing fires mixing with the beams from the decorative street lamps into an orange glow. The troops were rumbling up the avenue on packed lorries, their helmets glinting in the light, shooting as they came. As the first truck passed her, she saw that under their helmets the soldiers' faces were young, and many of them looked scared. Pedal carts were speeding up the street ahead of them, with bloody people lying crumpled across their wooden trays. And yet the crowd stayed, lining the avenue. As they stood there, like an audience in a ghastly parody of a patriotic parade, someone began to sing. It was the International. The words rang out. "Arise, ye prisoners of starvation. Arise, ye wretched of the earth." All around her people began to sing, and she sang too. They sang it as loudly as they could, this anthem of the oppressed, as the soldiers rode past. They sang not far from where Wei Jingsheng had once upon a time posted his plea for democracy on an ordinary wall. They sang where they had demonstrated in the weeks before, buoyed with excitement. They sang even as the trucks were followed by armored personnel carriers, and then by tanks, as the air filled with the guttural sound of an army turning their city into a battleground. Up ahead was a square where they would never go again with pleasure, a place that in the weeks before had truly felt like a public ground, a place where the last demonstrators were now waiting by the monument to the people's heroes for the final confrontation. And as she sang, her eyes fixed on a single child's shoe lying discarded on the ground, soaked with blood. By 1:30 a.m., the army was surrounding Tiananmen Square. Units had pushed up through Beijing from the north, south, east, and west, joining those already sequestered within the buildings lining the square. Each unit had encountered resistance. Each had answered with deadly force. Now they sat and waited for the next move. For a couple of hours, wounded demonstrators had been arriving at the square, yet thousands of demonstrators still clustered around the monument to the people's heroes. They still clung to their role as heroes, all the more reluctant to leave now that all across the city people were dying in their cause. As in the weeks before, a debate broke out between those urging retreat and those who wanted to stay. Hou Zhijian exhorted the students to leave. Enough blood had been spilled that night to awaken the people, he said, and the students had already shown that they were not afraid to die. They need not do more. But the student leader, Chailing, refused to direct the students either to stay or to go. This, she declared, should be their choice to make. Finally, Hou Zhijian and Liu Xiaobo decided to try and negotiate safe passage for the students. It was almost 4 a.m. when the two men drove in an ambulance up to the army lines and presented their offer to an officer. If the army would agree not to shoot, they would organize the students to leave the square. The offer was accepted, but they were told to hurry. Deng's dawn deadline was dictating the course of events. The students then held one final vote. The question to leave was to be decided on the voices. When the vote was called, the shouts to stay sounded just as loud as the votes to go. The student leader who called the vote declared it a vote to go. Later he explained why. Those wanting to go would be embarrassed to yell too loudly, he reasoned, while those wanting to stay would be all the louder in their bravado. So if both sounded the same, it must be a majority to go. And so they began to leave. The army was already moving in on the students by this time, pushing towards them slowly with their guns at the ready. There was no time left to debate. The student leaders performed one last service, insisting the students drop any weapons they might have and leave in orderly lines. The students retreated under the banners of their colleges, singing "The International" and holding hands. Behind them, the goddess of democracy toppled to the ground. The tanks took up their position on the square. The army had delivered it to the government once more. It seems Deng Xiaoping got his wish that morning, and no one was killed within the square itself. It was a distinction that the government would make much of in the days, months, and years that followed. But even China's official figures recorded hundreds of deaths and thousands of injuries outside the square as the army prosecuted its mission. Figures initially released by the Chinese Red Cross, but then retracted, suggested thousands had died, as did a melancholy news report by Radio Beijing broadcast on the afternoon of June 4th. In the immediate aftermath, BBC journalist Kate Adie, who produced some of the most compelling reports on the massacre, reported a figure of 1,000 killed based on sources within Beijing's hospitals. The most exhaustive attempt to count the dead was undertaken by Canadian historian Timothy Brook, who visited Beijing in the months after June 4th. Based on contemporaneous reports of casualties counted at a number of Beijing hospitals, he arrived at a figure very near the initial Chinese Red Cross figure of 2,600 dead. The true figure may never be known, but the sheer diversity of those who died speaks to the indiscriminate nature of the Army's actions and refutes the government's claims that the majority of those who died were counter-revolutionary riots. Children died as well as pensioners in their homes. Pedicab drivers were shot while trying to deliver the injured to hospitals, as were ambulance drivers. Deaths reached into the highest government circles, too. The chauffeur of one of the elders was killed, as was the son-in-law of a senior official of the National People's Congress. He was a man at Mushidi shot while fetching water by a lighted kitchen window. The actions of some of the bereaved also speak to the immensity of the tragedy. A father carried the body of his 4-year-old son around with him for days after June 4th, showing his wounds to anyone who would look. University students paraded the bodies of their slain classmates around the campuses of Tsinghua, Peking University, the People's University, and the Beijing Language University. At the Chinese University of Political Science and Law, students laid out the body of one of their classmates on a table and surrounded him with ice, keening for him. The violence did not stop once the square was cleared. Many more people were killed in the hours that followed. An official report to the leadership told of one particularly cold-blooded attack on a group of students making their way home to the university on foot, having earlier evacuated the square. A tank charged into their group, killing 11 instantly. Despite the danger, as terrible as the day of June 4th wore on, Beijingers continued assembling near the square to pay witness to what had occurred and to protest. All through that day, Western journalists watched horrified from their vantage points in the Beijing Hotel, just east of the square, as soldiers fired point-blank into small crowds of people who gathered to curse the soldiers. Dozens died in broad daylight on the Avenue of Eternal Peace. The number of military casualties during the crackdown is also uncertain. There is no doubt that soldiers died in the action, some brutally murdered by the crowd. The official toll announced in the days immediately following June 4th counted 23 soldiers dead and 200 missing. Later research by a Chinese historian, Wu Renhua, identified 14 military deaths, of whom 8 had been killed in direct fighting with demonstrators. In the absence of a full public accounting for the bloodshed, the details of these soldiers' stories too are missing from history. Like millions of people around the world, I watched the events unfold on television. I had left China the summer before on a high. The chill that had fallen on the city after the removal of Hu Yaoban had been replaced by an almost feverish atmosphere of excitement. At the start of the year, I had witnessed with some amazement the first open press conference ever held during the National People's Congress, although the rest of the proceedings had taken place behind closed doors. People close to the government seemed to welcome the chance to discuss China's situation openly. River Elegy had been broadcast in the weeks before I left, and it seemed no one could decide which was more extraordinary, the argument it contained or the fact that it had been broadcast at all. My own belief was that it was inevitable that China would ultimately embrace some kind of democracy. Yes, there would be reversals, as there had been in 1979, 1983, and in 1987, but in the end, these would only be brief setbacks. When students and ordinary Beijingers began to fill the square in the spring of 1989, I felt that energy and passion I had experienced in Beijing's underground was finally breaking cover. This is what I had seen behind closed doors, I thought, a sense that the entire society had to change, a longing for a role to play in what could be a great venture. And there was also just a longing for color, excitement, romance. I'd seen people singing Cui Jian in their homes, and now they were singing him in Tiananmen Square. As the weeks passed, I watched events unfold, gripped by every twist. When the People's Daily editorial was issued, I felt a chill of fear that was instantly replaced by excitement at the bravado of the students and, more importantly, the ordinary people of Beijing. I watched almost with disbelief when Chinese journalists, who I knew as cowed and depressed by their designated role in state propaganda, suddenly took to the streets to demonstrate and later began to actually report what was going on. Even as the weeks wore on and the stalemate became more evident, I was still excited, still hopeful that it would all end well. Martial law was a shock, But when Beijingers flooded into the streets to reason with the soldiers, and they in turn consented to be stopped, I began to believe that the government must surely recognize that only a political solution could work. Even on the evening of June 3rd, as I watched the news pictures of the soldiers yet again being prevented from entering the capital, I believed it would be okay. Surely the People's Army would never turn on the people. I believed the long-standing propaganda as much as any Chinese citizen. The army were the most beloved of people, after all. I had invited friends to dinner at my home in Sydney on June 4th, not realizing that it would turn out to be a wake. All through that night, as we drank much and ate little, I tried hopelessly to call Beijing. Over and over I called the apartments of friends in the diplomatic compounds, hoping they would have news of friends who we knew had been in the square and who we had no way of contacting. The very first Chinese friend I had made was at my house that night. 3.5 years since he had taken me to his Hutong home to see his paintings, he was now a Sydney-sider. Given a chance to come to Australia earlier that year for an artist's exchange, he had chosen not to go back. His girlfriend, my friend, had been in the square every day. Now he sat pale and terribly still, watching me as I tried to every phone number I had. In the days that followed, we rode a roller coaster of hope and despair. Rumors circulated of dissension in the army, of some units facing off against others on the outskirts of Beijing. Rumors, too, that the government might fall. It would be 5 days before there was any sign of the leadership, and in those days, we dared to wonder. On June 5th, we had a moment that brought a kind of comfort, even joy, as we watched a young man stand in front of a row of tanks rolling down Chang'an Avenue. In his neat white shirt and dark pants, he seemed to stand in for all the Beijingers who had faced down the army for so long. In those days, I watched the footage from Beijing over and over again. In the flare of tracers across the sky, the soldiers with rifles cocked, stalking across the square silhouetted by fire, the goddess of democracy crumbling to the ground, the students leaving Tiananmen in the gray dawn light, flashing peace signs and hugging each other, and the terrible footage of the injured being rushed to hospital, the pedal carts that once might have carried spring strawberries speeding down the street laden with the dead and dying. As before, I found a line of poetry stuck in my head. This time it was Yeats and his famous poem, Easter 1916, about the Easter Rising in Ireland against the British. He too had seen ordinary people transformed by events. All changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. 2 months later, Shen Qi caught the train back to Beijing. He had left the capital before the end of May, his parents' pleas finally too hard to resist. The news on television had told of a bloody riot in which soldiers had been lynched by an angry mob. People arriving home in Hefei from Beijing told a different tale, of citizens slaughtered on the streets. On the train were 2 obvious army types, but they were in mufti. Since Shen Qi had been a kid, he had dreamed of being one of them. As a child, he even borrowed a uniform from a cousin who was a soldier and had himself photographed in it. He loved that photo, and now the soldiers were hiding their uniforms away. Once on the streets of Beijing, evidence of what had happened was all around him, in the bullet-scarred walls along Chang'an Avenue, and in the eyes of the heavily armed soldiers who still patrolled the streets. The soldiers had hatred in their eyes, but also fear. They were too frightened to go into a public toilet alone, Shen Qi told me. One evening he was riding his bike east along Chang'an Avenue from Xidan and was stopped by soldiers and questioned. They treated me as if I was an enemy. I had dreamed of being one of them, and now they were pointing their guns at me. My dream collapsed. I started to become skeptical about everything. I started to question everything, mistrust everything. I think it was kind of a sickness. It was then, he told me, that I really understood Beidou's poem, I Do Not Believe. Shen Qi drifted through the days. Once he had felt part of a new generation. They were young and had believed they had a shining future. Now all seemed lost. He began an affair with a new girl. It turned out she had been wounded on June 4th. She showed him the scars. He had dreamed of being a soldier, a hero, an artist, but now it all seemed laughable. 5 years ago, when he had been accepted to college, he had run for joy. Now he felt heavy and old. He wished there was some way he could just cut himself free of the past, to cut time in two. One day he found himself listening to the radio in the apartment he was staying. Over the airways came the raucous banter of crosstalk China's traditional form of comedy. Two comedians were going at each other hammer and tongs, out-punning each other in a rising cacophonic duel of sound. He started to laugh. He couldn't stop. Suddenly, he seemed to have soared high above himself. He looked down and watched the blood flow from his left hand. In the right, he held a knife. He felt released, like his soul had jumped free of his body. And his blood kept pouring from where, in his madness, he had cut his little finger clean away from his hand. Everywhere else in the world, the magic year of 1989 delivered on its promise. 200 years after the storming of the Bastille, revolution again swept Europe. The Berlin Wall fell, and the communist governments of Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania were toppled. I watched with joy as the East Germans broke down the wall, and excitement as the Eastern Bloc crumbled. But I was also filled with sadness and anger. When the students first went to the square, I, like them, had not longed for the government to fall, but now I raged. How was it possible that all these other communist regimes could fall like ninepins, and China's, which had murdered its own people, hardly seemed disturbed? 20 years later, a Chinese friend confided that it was only by thinking, in 10 years, this gang of murderers will be swept away, that he had kept himself from going mad in those terrible weeks and months after June 4th. In those days, I tried to believe the same. 25 years later, I asked Guo Jian what was the most frightening thing he confronted that night of June 3rd. Was it facing all the dead in the hospital, or trying to rescue wounded from the street? He told me it was neither. What was the scariest, he said, was realizing that it could have been him riding into Beijing that day. I saw these young men in uniform, just like I had been, and I saw them shoot at unarmed people, and I thought, if I was still in the army, I would have been expected to do these things. I would have been sent here to kill. And you think, surely you would have resisted, but then you realize you probably would have followed orders, because that's what soldiers do. That's the thing that scares me the most. Looking at them in uniform, firing and maneuvering like I had been taught, I realized that up there on the truck was a young soldier, and he was me. And down in the street there was a student, and he was me too. On that day I was killing myself. Chapter 6. Nothing to my name. Early in a new decade, a 13-year-old boy named Jia Aili went exploring in his gritty northeastern town. He had discovered a marvelous new playground, factory halls where gigantic machines and intricate industrial equipment stood shrouded in dust, and not a living soul there to challenge him. On one unforgettable day, he made his way into a warehouse full of military aircraft, where half-built engines and disembodied wings waited for assembly crews that would never come. His town felt like a paradise to him, but it was an industrial graveyard. Jia Aili was born in Dandong in Liaoning Province, a region once celebrated by Mao Zedong for its economic contribution as the eldest son of the nation. Liaoning had industrialized early. Rich in natural resources, it had been built up under Japanese occupation, and in the early decades of the People's Republic, it became the center of China's heavy manufacturing. Under the communist system of state ownership and central planning, Liaoning's factory had at one time supplied more than 70% of the nation's iron and 60% of its steel, and by the dawn of Deng Xiaoping's era of reform, 10% of China's medium and large state-owned enterprises were located in the province. These entities dominated life for the people of the region, supporting them from cradle to grave with work, housing, healthcare, retirement pensions, employment opportunities for their children, and even entertainment. Employees in the Northeast were the aristocracy of the workers' state, toiling for the grandest of the nation's central plans. But from the moment that China embraced Deng Xiaoping's new reform blueprint in 1978, the workers' influence waned. No longer was China focused on self-sufficiency and the nation's basic needs, but on a new vision where the country would be the factory of the world, catering to the appetite of the West for consumer goods. These would not be produced in the old industrial towns of the Northeast, but in the newly tooled factories of the rising South. By the end of the 90s, millions would be thrown out of work in Liaoning Province, among them Jia Aili's parents. Many of them found themselves without adequate pensions or much prospect of finding meaningful work, reduced to watching powerlessly while enterprises they had once considered their own were bankrupt and their assets transferred into the hands of those with power or influence, a new aristocracy which the workers had little chance of joining. Tucked up in the region once known as Manchuria, bordering North Korea to the east and with Russia to the north and Mongolia to the west, the towns of Liaoning province could only dream of the opportunities opening up for China's southern coastal cities, whose close neighbors were the booming economies of Hong Kong and Taiwan, and whose ports looked towards Southeast Asia and beyond. It was there that Deng Xiaoping created the special economic zones, and it was there that rural workers flocked from the communes in search of a new life. Meanwhile, Jia Aili wandered in the shuttered factories where dust danced in the shafts of light that fell on disused turbines and forgotten flying machines. Years later, crashed planes and ruined machinery would appear again, like ghosts on the giant canvases that would make his name. 3,000 kilometers south of Jia Aili's home in the summer of 1992, 5 girls were involved in an intricate game in the garden. They jumped, they ran, they smiled, they stopped. Then they started all over again. The girls weren't really playing, though they were pretending. In fact, they were acting, and the older sister of one of them was directing. She had done something daring. After a year of studying in a hard-won place at university, she had dropped out to join China's infant advertising agency. Today she was shooting her first ad. It was for acne cream, and wasn't that enough to make any teen jump for joy? Her little sister was delighted, but not by the prospect of clear skin. For a few years now in her home in Guangzhou, she had been watching the advertisements broadcast from Hong Kong, 120 kilometers away. Now, she was learning how those ads were made, how to create, and how to fake. Her name was Cao Fei, and like Jia Aili, she was destined to be an artist. Cao Fei was born in 1978, and Jia Aili in 1979. They are both children of the era of reform and opening up. They have no direct memory of the time before Deng Xiaoping, no memory of Mao, no baggage from the Cultural Revolution. Their lives were shaped by the new revolution that started when they were born. And yet, they did feel the echoes of the earlier era. Cao Fei felt it in the way her parents embraced new opportunities with such hunger. Her mother had spent the Cultural Revolution restoring propaganda films frame by frame so they could be sent out on tours to educate the masses. Her father, a sculptor, had focused his talent on a single subject, Chairman Mao, so that the great helmsman could stand in yet another city square, at one more factory gate, in one more commune. Now Cao Fei's parents were restored to their original occupations as teachers, and they were also free to take work beyond the doors of the academy. Her father took commissions for portraits of a vast new cast of characters, local heroes, pre-revolutionary historical figures, even an influential foreigner with a curious name, Juan Antonio Samaran, who Cao Fei's father cast in bronze as part of China's campaign to win the favor of the International Olympic Committee. Cao Fei's mother, in her spare time, began to create delicate prints depicting a kind of private life that just a few years before had been derided and condemned. She rejoiced in works that had no revolutionary meaning at all, dwelling on imagined pleasures as simple as a woman playing with a cat. Meanwhile, both parents buried themselves in the avalanche of new reading that suddenly became available, books about artists like Rodin, Monet, and Picasso. For Jia Aili, the echoes of the past were more poignant. The new era made his parents redundant, and the grand economic plans for which they had toiled were gone. As Cao Fei's south boomed, Jia Aili's north was rusting away. As Cao Fei's parents saw new horizons opening up, Jia Aili's saw the things that gave their life meaning shuttered away in deserted factories. And yet, the new era brought Jia Aili an opportunity that no one in his family had ever had before. At the end of the decade, he would find himself at university, having sat the open exam that had been re-established by Deng Xiaoping in the early days of the reforms. Cao Fei and Jia Aili were destined to be part of an in-between generation, young enough to have escaped the dark experiences of the Cultural Revolution, but old enough not to take the shiny new China of today at face value. They would understand it had not been achieved without loss and pain. It is the subtlety of perception that marks these 30-somethings and makes them, as Cao Fei remarked to me one day, neither natural optimists nor pessimists. "We are always Le Guan, Bei Guan, always optimism and pessimism together," she said. More than any other generation, they represented the polarities of today's China, and even in their work they reflected the contrasting experiences of a single generation. As Jia Aili presented his melancholy vision of China in the time-honored materials of oil and canvas, Chao Fei creates her work on video and on the internet, sending out her avatars to explore alternative worlds. In the 1990s, when Chao Fei and Jia Aili entered their teens, was destined to be the most wrenching of the decades since 1978, the most rapid period of change that China had ever experienced. Millions of people's lives would be transformed for better or for worse. As a way of life passed away in the north, a new one would open up in the south. Fortunes would be made that would open up a gap between rich and poor that today yawns wider than ever. A middle class would begin to form, and a new unspoken contract would be made between rulers and the ruled. The terms were clear. We can make you richer than you've ever been, but political power must rest with the party alone. China's security today still rests on maintaining the stability of that grand bargain struck a quarter of a century ago. Chao Fei's hometown of Guangzhou was to play a leading role in the transformation of China. Today the city leads a southern Chinese economy based on the Pearl River Delta, which accounts for almost 40% of China's trade and 20% of its GDP. But during the 1980s, Guangzhou itself developed only slowly, as a matter of deliberate policy. In the 1980s, Zhao Ziyang had promoted the use of Special Economic Zone as safe spaces in which China could experiment. In these zones, foreign investment, private enterprise, and the creation of new export-oriented industries could be pioneered without risking the positions of the traditional leaders of China's industrial economy. By the end of the 1980s, the experiment had already proved an extraordinary success, attracting substantial foreign investment and local entrepreneurship. The leading special economic zone was Shenzhen. It had been barely more than a fishing village in 1980, but when declared a special economic zone, it became a magnet for workers from around the country. Located just across the border from Hong Kong, Shenzhen became a kind of annex to the still British-administered territory. Hong Kong businesses relocated en masse to Shenzhen in the pursuit of cheaper land and labor, and the once ubiquitous Made in Hong Kong label would be overtaken by one reading Made in China. Shenzhen became known for its free-wheeling atmosphere, while its venerable older brother Guangzhou, just 100 kilometers away, remained relatively staid and unmoved. Then in the early 1990s, Deng turned his attention to Guangzhou and to Shanghai, looking to these historically important port cities to help drag China out of the slump that had followed the events of 1989. It might have been thought that Deng's ruthless actions in 1989 would have enhanced his position as the dominant figure in Chinese politics, but in the months following the crackdown, he found himself instead on the defensive as his treasured economic reforms came under threat. Party hardliners who had long been suspicious of opening the economy and who hankered for the days of central planning argued that it was the speed and scope of Deng's reform that had provoked the Tiananmen protests. They argued for a slower pace of growth, increased central control, and stricter ideological purity. The toppling of Zhao Ziyang and the purge of reformist voices inside and outside the government left Deng all the more exposed, and a conservative low-growth strategy was accordingly endorsed. Arguments even began to be made that special economic zones should be abolished altogether. These were frightening years for the communist regimes. The toppling of the Eastern Bloc governments in 1989 was a grim warning of what might happen in China, and the resignation of Gorbachev in 1991, followed by the breakup of the Soviet Union, was deeply shocking. In the new decade, the world seemed to be tilting on its axis toward the capitalist West. But Deng believed there was more to fear from low growth than economic reform. Only rapid growth, he believed, would help China escape the drag of its huge population and underdevelopment. No doubt he saw that only by delivering a better life could the Communist Party's legitimacy be maintained. China had no choice but to ride the tiger. Finally, in January 1992, he fixed on a plan to use his personal influence and charisma to go over the heads of the leadership in Beijing to restart his reforms. He announced a Southern Inspection Tour, traveling to Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen in order to assess their development. The term Southern Inspection Tour, Nanxun, was chosen carefully. It was used by the great Qing Emperor Kanxi to describe his 6 expeditions to the southern reaches of his empire in the middle years of his reign, 1661 through 1722. With this echo of a lost era of Chinese glory, Deng was signaling the importance of his own journey. He aimed to draw attention to the success of Shenzhen and finally give his blessing to the long-dampened ambitions of Shanghai.